welcome everybody. Good morning. I'm Dan Masmanian. I'm the director of the USC Judith and John Bedrosian Center on Governance and the Public Enterprise and the Bedrosian Chair of Governance in the School of Policy, Planning, and Development. And I want to welcome everyone to this second in our series of 4 panel discussions of presidential leadership and what we can learn through the Ronald Reagan presidency. The opportunity, I think, provided all of us by the centennial of Ronald Reagan's birth and our partnership with the Reagan Foundation in this quest, I think, is both quite important and actually quite novel. So I'm very pleased that we're able to do this with the Ronald Reagan Foundation. For those of you who were not with us yesterday afternoon and evening, you missed, I think, a rather fascinating treatment and discussion of executive leadership within the presidential administration, and for that I want to thank Rich and Jim and Michael and Peter, and the always captivating narrative and picture painted of Ronald Reagan's California by none other than Kevin Starr in his keynote address. We're now, this morning, turning to the fascinating topic of the role of presidents as communicators, and using the bully pulpit the Office of the President provides. And so it's my pleasure to introduce the panel moderator and colleague, Tom Holohan, who in turn will introduce the members of the panel. So Tom is professor of communications at our USC Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism, where he specializes in the area of argumentation, political campaign communications, contemporary rhetorical criticism, and the impact of globalization on public deliberation. And lo and behold, we're gaining an eye full of that right now around the globe. He's author of numerous books and articles on these issues and is an active leader in the communications field and the public discourse. Tom, we couldn't be more pleased that you have agreed to moderate our panel this morning. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you also to Dean Knott from the School of Policy, Planning, and Development for your leadership in this event, and thanks to my own Dean, Ernie Wilson, for asking me to play a role in organizing this panel and engaging with PPD to plan this event. One of the colleagues who was supposed to be with us today but was unable to attend is Dean Rod Hart of the College of Communication at the University of Texas. And in one of his most provocative books on presidential leadership, a book called The Sound of Leadership, Hart makes the argument that modern contemporary political leadership is all about communication, public speaking, and being able to connect, to motivate, and share vision with the American public. Hart makes the observation that in the modern era of the presidency, the big significant change that's occurred is that presidents speak more often, they speak to more varied venues, and they speak beyond the reach of Washington, D.C. Through the developments of modern transportation and modern technology, the presidency has become a bully pulpit that is able to go on the road, and perhaps no president in modern history better reflected the ability to reach out to international as well as national audiences than did Ronald Reagan. President Reagan understood that the presidency was a role that could be performed, and that leadership was not just something that one did, it is something that one literally embodied. And he created a compelling leadership vision that depended upon his own character and selling that character as a natural character that suited the demands, needs, and interests of the American people. Reagan also understood that a compelling plot line meant that your story had to be told often enough that people identified its elements, and that it had to be told in a way that made it seem genuine, so that people had their own role in the plot as it emerged. The plot line that Reagan developed was one of optimism and encouragement. He understood that the American people wanted optimistic leadership, that they were filled with the courage of their own convictions and needed only to be motivated to see those convictions become reality. After an era of the embarrassment and disorder of corruption in the Nixon administration and perhaps the melees and lack of excitement and initiative of the highly detailed but not especially visionary Carter administration, the American people yearned for a different kind of presidential leadership, and Reagan supplied that leadership. He was patient, and I think he was principled. He understood that the democratic process meant that people needed someone to inspire them. And so leadership in a democratic era meant not just communicating ideas, but communicating a style. And the style that Reagan communicated emphasized not so much traditional notions of intelligence or intellectual gift. I don't think anyone would say that Reagan had the preparation to have been America's most intellectual president, but it is arguable that Reagan may have been one of the most emotionally intelligent presidents. He managed to disagree with people without being disagreeable, an attribute that I think is very similar to some other presidents who've achieved greatness in American history. One might cite Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one of Reagan's own admired presidents, and one might indeed cite our current president as someone who demonstrates this ability to remain somewhat unflappable and focused on his job, even at a time when there is profound disagreement. There is a sense in which we can look back at the era of Reagan almost with a kind of mystified innocence that America had come so far and yet has changed in many ways away from the ideals of Reagan. So I think it's important as we study the Reagan legacy that we literally have an argument about understanding Reagan's character so that we claim the legacy of Reagan to serve a broad array of national interests and not narrow, highly partisan interests. When Reagan's name is invoked, it should be something in that name that liberals as well as conservatives can find and celebrate. They may celebrate different elements of the Reagan vision, but I submit that liberals, too, want to claim that part of the Reagan legacy which emphasizes his respect for his adversaries, his ability to work across the aisle to actually achieve political change, and his desire to make sure that the government is as optimistic and as civil as are the American people. I am very pleased with the panel that I've assembled for you to hear this morning. First of all, pleased because they represent some of my closest friends in the field of political communication. I think after you hear them, you'll be wanting to make their friendship as well. Our speaker and the primary presenter of the paper today is Professor Robert C. Rowland of the University of Kansas. Best known to his friends as Robin. As he's aged, he's become more sober and has gone back to the name on his birth certificate. Rowland is the former chair of the communication department at the University of Kansas. He was a national championship debater at the University of Kansas, so if he starts talking fast and spewing words, just give him the sign, slow down. He's capable of doing that. He's the author of 4 different books on rhetoric and the power of the spoken word. And in addition, he's written some 50 or 60 articles, at least a dozen of which touch on various elements of the Reagan presidency and the Reagan rhetorical style. Rowland is especially interested in foreign policy rhetoric and in the relationship between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And so his paper, as you'll hear, is going to especially look at Reagan and his foreign policy discourse. We also have 3 respondents who are going to give brief remarks both to Rowland's paper and to their interaction and understanding of the Reagan presidency. First will be Professor Craig Smith, who is the director of the Center for First Amendment Studies and a professor of communication studies at California State University, Long Beach. Craig is like the utility fielder on the baseball team. Whenever they need a chair of any department at Long Beach, Craig is the go-to guy, because he's also been the chair of the Film and Electronic Arts Department, the School of Journalism, and the Communication Arts and Sciences Department. He is a deputy director of the National Republican Senatorial Campaign. He was the director of Senate Services for the Republican Conference of the United States Senate. He has been a speechwriter for President Gerald Ford, and he has been an advisor to CBS News on political discourse during the Republican conventions. Craig is interesting then because he lives both in an academic as well as in an applied political world, and he's one of my few good Republican friends. Our second respondent is Dr. Mary Stuckey of Georgia State University. Mary, whose training is in political science, sits as a member of a communication faculty. Her PhD is from the University of Notre Dame, though she tells me she grew up here in Southern California and is rather happy to be back. Mary has also written many books. She has 9 books and more than 50 articles and book chapters, much of that work focused on the rhetorical discourse generated by American presidents. She has studied the rhetoric of Ronald Reagan, particularly in the Challenger Address, and the theory and practice of political communication as reflected in contemporary presidents. She's not only an outstanding scholar, she's an outstanding teacher, and she's highly engaged with her students. And so I'm delighted that Mary could be with us to bring us a Southern perspective of the Reagan presidency. Finally, I'm joined by my good colleague from USC, Daniel Schnoor. Dan is the chairman of the California Fair Political Practices Committee and the director of the Jesse M. Unruh Institute for Politics in the School of, or Department of Political Sciences at USC. Dan has also served extensively in Republican politics. He was the communication director for John McCain's 2000 presidential primary campaign. So when you get a chance in the hallway, ask him what he really thought about the McCain and George W. Bush relationship. Schnoor started work in politics working in the Ronald Reagan White House, and then he continued and worked with the Reagan and Bush campaign in 1984. He was later a spokesperson for the Bush Quayle campaign and also worked on the staff of Governor Pete Wilson in the communication staff. And so Dan, many of you may know if you read any media, he's probably the most quoted faculty member at USC at the moment. He's the go-to guy for any reporter who's on deadline and wants a smart comment about a breaking political story. The way I hope that the panel unfolds is that Professor Rowland, Professor Ronald will spend about 20 minutes presenting his paper. Then each of the respondents will have 5 minutes, and then the panel will converse for a bit of time. But we are committed to leaving time for questions from the audience at the end. So without further ado, Professor Ronald.
You know, you set the bar pretty high with the introduction, but then to call me Reagan, that sets ridiculous standards for me to meet. I want to thank everyone from USC and the Reagan Foundation for putting together this wonderful conference. I want to tell you, as an added benefit from my perspective, at home it's 15 degrees with 9 inches of blowing snow. While many aspects of Reagan's legacy are quite contested, on one point there is universal agreement: Reagan's rhetorical skill. This was recognized very early on. Adam Clymer wrote on Christmas Day in 1981 that Reagan's ability to make a case is conceded on all sides. Mary Stuckey wrote in an early book on Reagan's rhetoric that Reagan is a model by which other presidents will be judged. And yet, while there's consensus on Reagan's rhetorical skill, the explanation of where that skill came from is quite different. There's really disagreement. Liberals tend to focus on the optimism, the homey stories. The New York Times editorialized after Reagan's death that Reagan projected an aura of optimism so radiant that it seemed almost a force of nature. Conservatives tend to focus on Reagan's principles and talk about his toughness. So Peggy Noonan's observation about the Westminster speech, I think, is really kind of typical of much conservative commentary. She said it signaled the beginning of a massive shift from the defensive crouch in which the Western democracies had long huddled into a tall walking, truth-telling style of faithfulness that would ultimately move mountains. The problem here is that neither of these views focuses very much on the substance of what Reagan said. And it strikes me that while there are people here who knew the president intimately, the American people knew President Reagan from his words. And so I want to take those words seriously and focus on the substance of what the man said. And I want to begin that with an anecdote. About 25 years ago, and one of the first things I wrote about President Reagan, I wrote about his performance in the single presidential debate with President Carter in 1980. The conventional wisdom of the media about that debate is that Reagan was much better on the style and Carter was much better on the substance. The New York Times said presidential debates are like a musical. They have words and music. Carter won the words. Reagan won the music. Now, I think the New York Times is right on one point. Reagan was better on the style than President Carter, although that was not exactly the high hurdles to be better than President Carter. I analyzed that debate as if it were a real debate. And what I found was that, and Tom's done an analysis of that as well, that Reagan did a much better job of answering the questions. He cited a lot more evidence than Carter. And in the rebuttals in that debate, and it's the only presidential debate that had a section where there were two rebuttals, a format so successful that it has never been used again, that Reagan was much, much better than Carter. Now, you can script a first answer, but I don't know how you can script a first or a second rebuttal. I was a debate coach for many years. And it hit me immediately when I did that analysis that the stereotypes of Reagan were not accurate, that this was a person of substance. And it is to that substance that I want to now turn and talk about three principles. And the first of those is his commitment to principle in both his foreign policy and his domestic rhetoric. I secondly want to talk about pragmatism within that focus on principles. And then finally, I want to talk about the sense of authenticity that Reagan created. And I'm going to tie that to his own involvement in the speechwriting process. Now, this is a long paper, so I'm going to boil it down and focus more than anything else on the Soviet rhetoric. You know, on the Soviet Union, Reagan's legacy is quite contested. There are really two views of Reagan's legacy. The conservative and triumphalist view is often that Reagan, with his rhetoric and his policies, essentially forced the Soviet Union to surrender. But there are problems with this view. Recent scholarship has now focused on Reagan's nuclear abolitionism. We now know that Reagan was terrified of nuclear war and was a strong supporter of arms control from the beginning. We also know that Reagan was quite risk-averse. John Patrick Diggins quotes an advisor to Reagan as saying, "The president has the reputation of being a gunslinger, but he was the most cautious conservative guys in those meetings." We also know that by the end of his presidency, the conservatives who now praise him for winning the Cold War were singing a somewhat different tune. This is what George Will wrote at the time of the Moscow summit. But how wildly wrong Reagan is about what is happening in Moscow. Reagan has accelerated the moral disarmament of the West. Actual disarmament will follow. That's his friend, George Will. The revisionist view is almost exactly the opposite. It is that beginning in January of 1984, to set up the 1984 presidential election, that Reagan turned toward peace and turned toward arms control agreements with the Soviet Union. But again, this view is far too simple. First, the strident language continued after 1984, most notably in one of what is universally recognized as one of the great speeches of the 20th century at the Brandenburg Gate, where Reagan called on Gorbachev to open this gate and tear down this wall, language that his own national security staff tried to strip from the speech. Reagan famously said, in putting the language back in, "I'm the president, aren't I?" Reagan did that personally. And this continued even in the other addresses. The most famous speech at the end of his presidency at Moscow State, where people talk about the turn toward peace, included language that, while veiled, still sharply criticized the Soviet system. I see not change, but great continuity in Reagan's Soviet rhetoric, and I want to talk about three principles. Reagan viewed the Soviet Union as the most powerful and dangerous totalitarian government in the world, as a force of evil, and so he said that, and he said that quite consistently. Reagan supported a very strong defense policy, but a defense policy that I think was primarily rhetorical. Its goal was to send a message to the Soviets that we could not be bullied and that they could not win. rather than using, sometimes people use words as weapons. I think in this instance, Reagan used weapons in order to support his words. And finally, Reagan believed that the Cold War was ultimately about ideas, and that in terms of the ideas, we would inevitably win. Now, I want to make the point here, just very briefly about each of these views, that Reagan kept to this consistently. So take the first point, that Reagan labeled the Soviet Union as a dangerous totalitarian nation. Consider what Reagan said in the January 16, 1984 speech, where he supposedly turned sharply toward peace. He begins by talking about how over the last 10 years, the Soviets devoted twice as much of their GNP to military expenditures, and he goes on from there. He then labels the Soviet Union as a potential aggressor. He says later that cooperation and understanding are built on deeds, not words. And still later he says, realism means we must start with a clear-eyed understanding of the world we live in. We must recognize that we are in a long-term competition with a government that does not share our notions of individual liberties at home and peaceful change abroad. Reagan's tone changed over time, but he sharply criticized the Soviet Union throughout. Second point, he used a defense policy to support his words. It was a rhetorical policy. And Reagan made that very clear from the beginning. He made it clear that he was supporting an arms buildup in order to give the United States the credibility to eventually negotiate with the Soviet Union. He said, for example, in the January 16, 1984 speech I mentioned, that history teaches that wars begin when governments believe the price of aggression is cheap. To keep the peace, we and our allies must be strong enough to convince any potential aggressor that war could bring no benefit. And he said that times had changed, that now was the time to push for arms control because, and I'm quoting, we halted America's decline. Our economy is now in the midst of the best recovery since the 60s. Our defenses are being rebuilt, our alliances are solid, and our commitment to defend our values has never been more clear. Now, I also want to make the point that despite the stereotype when Reagan took office was that conservatives were thrilled and liberals were terrified. Liberals were terrified that the man would lead us into a nuclear war. And yet, from the very beginning, Reagan consistently called for arms control. Consider what he said in the Evil Empire speech. Reagan said, "This doesn't mean we should isolate ourselves and refuse to seek an understanding with them. I intend to do everything I can to persuade them of our peaceful intent, to remind them that it was the West that refused to use its nuclear monopoly in the 40s and 50s for territorial gain, and which now proposes a 50% cut in strategic ballistic missiles and elimination of an entire class of land-based intermediate-range missiles." Reagan himself wrote that first sentence and revised the second. He then added the following sentence in his own hand, "And we will never stop searching for a genuine peace." Reagan made his commitment clear, but neither side believed it. Liberals thought it was lip service, and conservatives became gradually quite afraid that he really meant what he said. The third point, the battle of ideas, I think you have to ask yourself, how could Reagan have remained optimistic at what was a very scary time in the Cold War? I think the answer to that puzzle is that Reagan really believed that the ideas of the Enlightenment, of Western liberalism, liberalism in the broad sense, not in the sense of the American political movement, were much stronger than the Soviet ideas. He said that most famously and most eloquently, and if you've not looked recently or at all at his speech to the House of Parliament on June 8th of 1982 at Westminster, where he said that democracy is not a fragile flower, but still it needs cultivating, you should look at it. It is, I think, his greatest presidential speech, and a speech where he presciently predicted that the Soviet Union would end up on the ash heap of history because the balance of ideas was on our side. We now know that he was completely right. He said that again and again in his other speeches. Now, I want to make the point that I think this constituted a kind of rhetorical theory of the Cold War. Speak the truth to get their attention. And if you look at the responses from Tass and Pravda to the Westminster speech, the Evil Empire speech, he very clearly got the attention of the Soviets. And with Brandenburg Gate, as R.W. Apple, someone you would expect to praise President Reagan, wrote after Reagan's death, said after the Brandenburg Gate speech, it would have been hard for Mikhail Gorbachev to believe that Americans had lost their will to resist Soviet power. And he joined with Mr. Reagan to bring the long struggle to a conclusion. The buildup that served the point of pressing the Soviets, and I quote Jack Matlock on how that buildup served a rhetorical aim. Jack Matlock, ambassador to the Soviet Union in the second term. And then the power of ideas. Ultimately, Reagan believed that ideas were the most important thing. And ultimately, as we did not defeat the Soviet Union, but they decided to tear down their own wall, their own empire, Reagan was proved correct. I want to switch and talk briefly about domestic policy rhetoric. And I don't have time to but sketch very, very broadly. And I want to begin with the first inaugural. The first inaugural is remembered almost exclusively for one line. In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. A line that is often cited by both liberals and conservatives as foundational of contemporary conservatism. In fact, Peter Baker argued that in President Obama's inaugural address that he seemed to be having a dialogue with President Reagan and refuting President Reagan. And former Republican Congressman Mickey Edwards has summarized the current contemporary operating philosophy as based on two essentials. First, government is bad, it's the problem. Second, big government is the worst. The echoes of Reagan should be obvious. But I think, and the point I've made so far about the Soviet rhetoric is that there was principle, but there was room for pragmatic adaptation as the Soviets changed. But I think Reagan sent the same signal in his domestic policy rhetoric. Let me tell you some of the other things that President Reagan said in the first inaugural. First, he made it quite clear that he sought a cut in government for pragmatic reasons. He was not starving the beast, but because he thought he could make government more effective. And listen to how inclusive he is. When I read this, ask yourself, does this sound like a contemporary conservative or a contemporary liberal? Well, this administration's objective will be a healthy, vigorous, growing economy that provides equal opportunities for all Americans with no barriers born of bigotry or discrimination. Putting America back to work means putting all Americans back to work. Ending inflation means freeing all Americans from the terror of runaway living costs. All must share in the productive work of this new beginning. Reagan, I think, had the most inclusive rhetoric of any conservative, a pragmatic conservative, also the most successful. Reagan also made it quite clear in that speech that his approach was fundamentally reformative. I believe it's 4 paragraphs after the famous attack on government. Reagan said, "Now, so there will be no misunderstanding. It's not my intention to do away with government. It's rather to make it work with us, not over us, to stand by our sides, not right on our back. Government can and must provide opportunity, not smother it, foster productivity, not stifle it." That's not an attack on all government. That's a call for a leaner government, smaller government, but a more effective government. And I think if you actually look at how Reagan's other words and how he governed, that the sketch I've given you of principle and pragmatism is reflected across his administration. Reagan is certainly a small government conservative. But with that said, he believed he needed to make government more effective. I've done a study with a co-author of the arc of Reagan's radio speeches beginning in 1982 that cross his entire presidency. I think it's a pretty good sample of what he's saying in all of those years, and the pattern I've described is there. And if you look at the pattern of his governance that we heard about yesterday, a willingness to make a deal to raise taxes, a willingness to work with liberals and others, I think you see exactly the same pattern. And it seems to me that this combination of pragmatism and principle explains a lot about Reagan's success. He appealed to conservatives with his attack on government, with his commitment. He appealed to all of the rest of us with his pragmatism, and it also allowed him to always express that optimism, that sense of hope. At this point, I want to very briefly talk about Reagan's sense, the authenticity he created. I noticed that, more than 25 years ago, Reagan always sounded like Reagan, always. And I knew he had to have lots of speechwriters. And at that time, my conclusion was he has to be heavily involved in the speechwriting process. It is still, you still occasionally see the stereotype that Reagan was a mere actor. New York Times talked recently about how Michael Deaver deployed his sunny optimism as if Deaver were the author of Reagan's success and not Reagan. We now know that's simply not true in a variety of ways. We know this from the memoirs of his speechwriters who talk about Reagan as his own best writer. But I want to talk for just a second about what the speechwriting and handwriting files at the Reagan Library say. And I want to focus especially on the Westminster Address, because I've just written a book about it. Reagan wrote 8 of the 56 paragraphs of that speech in his own hand. He edited, sometimes quite heavily, another 26 of those paragraphs. That's 60% of the speech. Does that sound like someone who's distant? In the radio speeches, he's involved in editing. The vast majority of the ones I looked at had some of Reagan's edits on it. Now, he's not as involved in the second term. But even in the second term, I've already told you the story of the Brandenburg Gate speech where he is pretty involved. Reagan was no policy wonk. But Reagan was an intellectual who, especially on the Soviets, always took ideas seriously. I think what the handwriting files reveal is he was a gifted writer and even better editor, and that the source of his authenticity comes from his own involvement. That's why he always sounded the same, and as we grew more comfortable with him, that's why I think the affection of the American people grew stronger and stronger for him. In 25 years of writing about Reagan, I have taken solace from the fact that I've always irritated both my liberal and conservative friends. My conservative friends are always irritated by the fact that I point out that Reagan had a pragmatic and moderate side. My liberal friends absolutely hate the fact that I argue that Reagan was a gifted writer, and Reagan was involved in his own creation of his own rhetoric. Come to think of it, they don't much like it when I say that Reagan was pragmatic either. But it seems to me that it was this gift. It was his gift to meld together absolute principle with pragmatic adaptation that made him always sound the same, that made him so appealing. But I want to end with one final point. Even for Reagan, we sometimes talk about rhetoric as if it were a magic wand. But the great communicator was not very great in the fall of 1982 and the months that followed. At that point, I'll give you the comment of a very distinguished journalist, Haynes Johnson. He said during the 1982 midterm election, Ronald Reagan has alienated just about every significant bloc of voters necessary to form an American political majority. And Newsweek reported on Reagan visiting Bob Michael's district in Illinois, not, you would expect, an unfriendly place. He was a minority leader in the House. He said the response to Reagan at that point was lukewarm at best. But then the economy came back, and the great communicator became great again, and suddenly it was morning again in America.
Thank you very much, Robin. Craig.
It's delightful to be back at USC. Coming from the shining campus on the beach to the shining campus here in downtown is always a nice trip, especially if you don't have to do it at rush hour. I'm delighted to be up here with my friends and colleagues. Tom Holohan and I were debate coaches together, and we've worked on various projects together. And I remember Robin when he was a debater, and I judged him, and I don't think I ever gave him a losing ballot. It's lovely to get together with Mary because we're on the opposite side of the political spectrum, but she's so much smarter than I am that I love talking to her. And of course, Dan Schneier is so wise, and his editorials are so wonderful, and we actually worked together on Pete Wilson's presidential campaign, short-lived though it was, and that was his fault, not mine. I just want to give a couple of examples from my personal experiences in meetings with Ronald Reagan that support the thesis that Robin has put before you, that he was both principled and that he was pragmatic, and that he toggled between the two strategically. You may not recall this, but in 1970, our campuses were in open revolt over the incursion into Cambodia. At Kent State, 4 students were killed during rioting on that campus. Ronald Reagan, again channeling FDR, instead of calling a bank holiday, called a college holiday. And the State University and the UC were closed down for 3 days. Some of us went around the state using that opportunity to do teach-ins. I taught one course at Redlands, a 2-hour course on Vietnam at Redlands. That was well received. I then went to UC Berkeley, and people threw garbage at me. So that made the press. In June, I got a call from an education aide to Ronald Reagan, Alex Sheriffs. You'll remember Alex, Peter. And he said that they were having some professors into the governor's office, that the governor wanted some advice about how to deal with a crisis on a campus. So 5 or 6 of us arrived at the governor's office. I was by far the youngest as an assistant professor. I was the only one with a beard at that time. They didn't even think I was, the other 4 didn't even think I was a professor until I was introduced to them by Alex. We then went in to meet with Governor Reagan. And Alex Sheriffs handled the moment in terms of seniority. So we had this senior professor of English from a campus that I won't identify, saying that the real problem on the campus was student demonstrators and we needed to keep dossiers on them. And then they went to the next professor, and he said, the real problem on the campus is graduate students. They're fomenting the undergraduates, and we need to keep dossiers on them. And then they went to the third guy, and he said, well, it's the assistant professors. They're the ones. And come on. And so it finally, it got to me, and I was so frustrated, I just kind of exploded. I just said, Governor Reagan, in all due respect, these people aren't talking about violations of academic freedom. They're talking about violations of civil rights of professors and students and so on. And Reagan, as only he could do, slammed both hands down on his desk, stood up, and he said, I have been through the witch hunts. They will not occur on our campuses in California, and he walked out of the room. Highly principled moment. The next moment, then I move on and I grow up and years go by, and I find myself working in the George H.W. Bush campaign in 78, 79. Little do I know that we're going to have a moment in New Hampshire that's going to make this into a real contest. Finally in May, Reagan wins, and delightfully for some of us, picks George H.W. Bush as his vice presidential choice, one of the better vice presidential choices in our history, but that's not saying much. During the buildup for SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, better known as Star Wars, there was a meeting that Reagan called of Republican senators. He wanted to brief them on the SDI program. He wanted to do it with no press, and he wanted to do it in private. Because I was close to the vice president, and at that time I was the director of Senate Services for the Republican caucus, I was allowed to sit in the room. Reagan explained SDI, and in the course of explaining it, an interesting thing happened. I had written a speech, because I had deep security clearance, for Senator John Chafee opposing SDI. And he needed someone with deep security clearance so that I could look at those documents and then frame a speech that made sense for him. And Reagan, in his presentation, he said, I know that some of you question SDI, like Senator Chafee here. And Chafee winked at me, and I winked at him, and then Reagan went on and he said, look, even if SDI doesn't work, it will spend the Soviets into the ground. They're so paranoid, they believe that it will work. And so here was the pragmatic side. Not only is this a principled thing that he really believed in, but if you don't buy that argument, there's a pragmatic reason to do this anyway. And so I saw this toggle between principle and pragmatism in Reagan as a wonderful kind of thing. I've written a book about Daniel Webster, and Daniel Webster, the great senator from the golden age of oratory in America, did the same thing. When he could go to principle to unite his audience, he would. When there was division in his audience, he became very pragmatic in order to unite them. And I think Reagan had that. Also, I was lucky enough to write a book chapter on Reagan on civil rights, and I had a lot of help from the Reagan Library. It's a wonderful place to do research, and they bring you all kinds of things that you'd never think you could get your hands on. And again, if you look at Reagan on civil rights, he was very, very principled in that area. And his administration has a very good record on civil rights that people often overlook. And one last thing I want to comment on in support of what Robin said. Robin rightly moves from the macro to the micro level when he talks about Reagan's involvement in the writing of speeches. And I wish you could see the whole piece that he's written. This is about half of it that he had time to deliver. But I want to extend his position on Reagan's use of statistics, but just giving you one example of the way Reagan would spin out a litany of statistics and then hit a punchline. And people would remember the punchline and forget that this man was highly involved with statistical analysis, much more than we see in presidential rhetoric in recent years. Listen to the following. The Soviets devoted twice as much of their gross national product to military expenditures as the United States, produced 6 times as many ICBMs, 4 times as many tanks, twice as many combat aircraft, and they began deploying the SS-20 intermediate-range missile at a time when the United States had no comparable weapon. Statistics, punchline, and it always worked. So I hail Robin's analysis. I support it from personal experience, and hopefully we'll get the whole thing out on the table somewhere published where we can all read it. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Mary?
Hi, good morning. First, I'd like to thank Tom and the conference organizers for honoring me with an invitation to participate in this conference. It's always amusing and a little frightening to be surrounded by Republicans. And I'd like to thank Robin especially because he got us his essay so early that I actually had time to read it before responding to it, which, for those of you who know academics, is a rare treat indeed. Robin has, as Craig noted, given us a particularly useful essay, combining as it does an artful combination of received wisdom and some recalibration of what we thought we knew about this most interesting of rhetorical and political figures. But what I think is most important in this essay is not all that it reveals about Reagan in particular, as interesting as that is, but what it tells us about the practices of presidential leadership in general. And to make this argument, I want to go back to another president, one who, with Reagan, sets the standard for rhetorical leadership in the 20th century. Because of my own work, I admit to a minor obsession with Franklin Roosevelt just now, but I don't think that that explains why I kept thinking of him as I read Robin's paper. I think that these two men had a great deal in common, and that these commonalities go a long way in explaining both the nature and the depth of their influence. Robin says of Reagan, for instance, that, quote, by always sounding the same, Reagan gradually convinced the American people that he was exactly who he seemed to be, end quote. Now, this always sounding the same does not mean, as Robin points out, that Reagan always said the same things. He was flexible about a good many things, most famously, for instance, his remark on changing a well-entrenched position that we were now hearing the sound of cement cracking under his feet. What sounding the same means, I think, is not a consistency of issue position, but of commitment to a certain clear set of principles. No matter what Reagan was saying, he was saying it in his own voice and from a position of what Robin calls authenticity. Roosevelt was certainly more changeable than Reagan. Indeed, his favorite metaphors for himself were cat, actor, and magician, at least 2 of which reveal a certain commitment to what might be understood as a decided lack of authenticity. But despite this difference in personal style, both FDR and Reagan were undeniably certain of their own internal compass and were willing to rely upon it, regardless of what others thought. They were both complicated men of simple faith, in themselves, in God, and in democracy. Clare Boothe Luce is widely quoted as noting that the great men of the 1930s and 40s all had a signature gesture. Hitler had his salute, Churchill his V, and Roosevelt, she would pause, wet her index finger, and hold it up. She meant this as a condemnation of FDR and his commitment to principle. And while it is, I think, both funny and apt, It is also a bit unfair, for in many areas, Roosevelt may have led the nation sideways, tacking, to use one of his own favorite nautical metaphors, back and forth along the political winds. But he knew, at least in general, where he was going. Nowhere is that more clear than in the preparedness debates leading up to World War II, and nowhere do he and Reagan evoke each other more clearly. Reagan's policies and rhetoric regarding the USSR are similar to FDR's in that he knew where he wanted to go, he was realistic about how to get there, and he engaged in a certain amount of sideways leadership in setting the course. The perils of such leadership are, as Robin points out, legion. One risks being accused of inconsistency, if not hypocrisy, risks alienating one's supporters, practically guarantees being misunderstood and misrepresented by the media. Both scholars and journalists seem to prefer direct kinds of leadership. It is easily understood and easily conveyed. But as FDR once said, it is a terrifying thing to be leading and to look over your shoulder and find no one there. I suspect that what I am calling sideways leadership increases the chances that when presidents look over their shoulders, someone will be behind them. This kind of leadership requires both a commitment to principle and a certain pragmatism about action, as Robin notes. It also requires something that Robin doesn't talk about explicitly, although I think he would have if he had more space in the essay, and that's a real sensitivity to audience. Full frontal leadership requires only principle. Unprincipled leadership requires only obedience to public opinion. Sideways leadership, the kind I attribute to FDR and Robin finds in Reagan, requires a certain sensitivity to audience, one that allows for delicate acts of maneuvering that facilitate the movement of audiences, both foreign and domestic. It may even require playing off elements of each audience against one another. It has been said of FDR, for instance, that one of his major accomplishments was preventing the mobilization of American anti-Semitism during the preparedness debates. Similar things can be said of Reagan as a coalition builder. The mobilization of some ideas and the muting of others are vital to leadership, but are very difficult to parse. Reagan had one other thing in common with FDR, and that was an ability to make firm statements with a certain geniality of manner that could be quite non-threatening. Equally important, and in this case Reagan differed markedly from Roosevelt, was in his ability to both be underestimated and to make use of that fact. Politics is not normally a profession for the humble, but Reagan was, I think, one of the least defensive men in our public life. Both his geniality and his lack of defensiveness enabled, I believe, his sideways leadership. By including FDR, I want to suggest that by pointing to this area of leadership, Robin is doing more than providing a worthwhile exegesis of Ronald Reagan and his particular brand of rhetorical leadership, although he has certainly done that. He's also telling us where to look for rhetorical leadership in the presidency as an institution, and I think that's every bit as important. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks to all of you, but in particular to Deans Knott and Wilson for allowing an escapee from the school, from the College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences to join the Annenberg and SPPD program here over the last couple of days. I also want to thank not only the people at Annenberg and SPPD, but in particular I want to thank John Bedrosian and the people of the Bedrosian Center for their involvement and support for this, and to thank Stuart McLaurin and his colleagues with the Reagan Centennial Celebration for giving us the opportunity to have this conversation. Mary made an excellent point in closing that I want to reiterate. To me, the real value of this discussion, at least of my role in it, is not as much to pay tribute to a particular president, but rather to the communication skills of all particular leaders, and not only to provide a guide for us to look for successful leaders, but lessons for those who aspire to achieve goals in that area. I also want to reassure Mary, feeling outnumbered here today.
I've got Robin on my
Okay,
side.
well, I feel your pain. My father and stepmother used the V-chip at our television set at home to block out the Fox News channel. So I know what it's like to talk to an audience that isn't always willing to listen, but I suspect you had much more success with this audience than I had at Thanksgiving dinner last fall. I'm particularly flattered to be asked to join this discussion, not because I bring any particular academic or practical insight, but as Tom briefly and semi-accurately noted, I began my political career on the Reagan-Bush 84 campaign. I decided at the ripe old age of 19 I wanted to work for President Reagan's re-election campaign, and at the ripe old age of 20, drove what I would now refer to as a ridiculously beat-up John Cougar Mellencamp Camaro from Whitefish Bay, Wisconsin, to Washington, D.C., with all my clothes and my typewriter in the back seat. And Jody, a typewriter is sort of like a word processor, but you just don't have to plug it in. Upon arriving in Washington, I found that 2 years of college, college newspaper reporter, and camp counselor did not make for an adequate resume to be hired to work in a political organization. So after learning that lesson at the Republican National Committee, I took out my typewriter and wrote a new resume. This one implied that I had a degree in broadcast communications and listed several legislative and local campaigns in Wisconsin and Minnesota on behalf of candidates who, to this day, have never existed. To the students in the audience, I would caution you that this occurred in the era before LinkedIn, Monster.com, or for all practical purposes, electricity. So I would recommend that you not try this at home. But I tell this story to let you know that at least for one teenager in the upper Midwest in the early 1980s, President Reagan's communication skills were more than adequate to change the direction of my career and in my life. I thought Professor Rowland did an extraordinary job of giving us an overview and analysis of President Reagan's strengths as a communicator. And I agree with my friend Craig Smith that I would encourage all of you to find a way to read the professor's entire paper, because it, as Mary mentioned, is not only timely, but very, very well done. I'm going to talk briefly about 3 points that Robert touched on, and perhaps take them in a slightly different direction. Number one, I want to talk about Reagan and political leaders as optimists. Number two, I want to talk about the emphasis on clarity, or depending on your vantage point, simplicity, that framed Reagan's communications skills. And third, I want to talk, oddly enough, on a panel about communications, I want to talk about policy and issues, because I would argue to you that they were, in fact, the real basis for Ronald Reagan's communication successes. So first of all, on the question of optimism, I think many observers, both his supporters, but certainly, as Robert mentioned, his detractors, talked about President Reagan's optimistic demeanor and attitude. And I would suggest to you that a more specific analysis would tell us that successful leaders are successful not simply because they are optimistic, but because they are optimistic in the face of adversity. It's relatively easy to be an optimist when the sun is shining and unemployment is at 4%. That's not so hard to do. But the much more difficult challenge, again, is to learn to be optimistic in difficult times, as our current president and our new governor are coming to terms with. I talked in one of the classes I teach. I teach a course in leadership in the college. And on this question, we take the old adage about the light at the end of the tunnel. And what I try to explain to my students is successful leaders of both parties, of all ideologies, are very successful, not simply at just talking about the light at the end of the tunnel, but first showing the tunnel before they sell the light. And Robert's analysis of Reagan's approach to his dealings with the Soviet, to me, is a perfect example of that. Talking about a danger, talking about a threat, talking about an evil empire is making people understand the nature of the challenge involved. He's showing them the tunnel. But ultimately, by talking about how we should never stop searching for a genuine peace, he sells them a light at the end of it. And I would suggest that by discussing the tunnel in such stark terms that earns him the credibility to talk about the light he strives for at the end of it. And it is a fine line to walk, as both President Bush and President Obama know, as both Governor Schwarzenegger and Governor Brown understand. If you only show the tunnel, you're too dour, and you lose those people because they'll never follow you. If you only sell the light at the end of it, you're out of touch, and they dismiss you for not understanding. And it's the balance not only for President Reagan, but for all successful leaders to achieve that balance. Second, I want to talk about clarity and simplicity, because I think, again, for all successful political leaders, their detractors tend to dismiss them as overly simplistic. And certainly Ronald Reagan's critics were no exception to that rule. I had a friend when I had a friend who I made when I was living in Washington back in the late 80s, early 90s. And she had worked in both Ronald Reagan's White House and in the White House of George H.W. Bush. And what she said what was the difference between those two experiences was the following. And this was a woman who had huge admiration for President Bush. She said, when you worked for Ronald Reagan, you went into work every day knowing that your task was to cut taxes, grow the economy, and fight communism. And everything that came into your inbox got framed in one of those three contexts, and you dealt with it accordingly. She said President Bush had just as ambitious and perhaps in some ways an even more ambitious agenda, but everything that came into our inboxes was dealt with in its individual terms. And because President Reagan, and again all successful leaders, are able to establish their goals in a much broader context, it becomes not only easier for their staffs, but for the voters, for the people they're trying to lead, to make sense of their numerous policy goals. And it greatly eases, I would suggest to you as a former press secretary and communications director, it greatly eases the communications director by focusing the public on a few broad principles. More importantly, though, and this gets to Professor Rowland's point on pragmatism and principle, by setting out those broad goals, what a successful leader does is they take the first steps toward achieving that balance. In other words, when you understand what those few broad goals and principles are, you can compromise to achieve those principles without compromising those principles themselves. Again, going back to Robert's paper, Ronald Reagan's goals were to grow the economy and to create jobs. Robert suggests in his paper that, and if I mischaracterize you, I apologize, is that shrinking government was not a goal, but rather a means to that broader end. And when he found what he felt were other, more achievable ways to that end, he adjusted, compromising to achieve principles rather than compromising those principles themselves. And I think finally and most importantly is the importance of policy in communications, or more accurately, why communications are overrated. And again, this comes from a former communications director, so take it appropriately. Inevitably in politics, the losing side of a campaign blames the messaging. And I don't mean to pick on Ronald Reagan's opponents here, because Republicans did it just as arduously in trying to explain away Bill Clinton's 2 elections as president. It's not that Ronald Reagan or Bill Clinton is forwarding a policy agenda that the American people actually agree with, but they are skilled orators. They are charlatans. They have found a way of fooling people into voting for someone with whom they don't disagree. And I would suggest to you that in a presidential campaign, blaming your loss on the messaging is sort of like the losing coach in a basketball game blaming the referee. It's facile, it's easy, but it avoids responsibility for, I think, a more substantive reason for your defeat. And regardless of whether you happen to agree with the policy outcomes or not, in 1980 and in 1984, most voters thought that taxes should be lower and that the United States should take a more aggressive stance in terms of its foreign policy and national security. And had Ronald Reagan campaigned for president wanting to raise taxes and hand Eastern Europe, or hand Europe over to the Soviet Union, I would argue to you that all the communication skills in the world would not have been particularly particularly helpful. As Robert mentioned, no one called him the great communicator after the 1982 midterm elections, but rather the difficult policy decisions he made in the first 2 years of his presidency began to lead to economic progress by the time he ran for re-election. And Ronald Reagan, who was just as skilled a communicator when he was reelected by carrying 49 states as he had been 2 years earlier when his party lost more than 24 seats in Congress, ultimately began to be recognized as a successful communicator because voters decided that his presidency was more successful. I'd suggest to you that the difference between emotional resonance and maudlin overreach is simply a function of the rate of unemployment in a society at any time. And finally, that as I mentioned a moment ago, Ronald Reagan, I would conclude, was not a successful president because he was the great communicator, but that voters, but rather because he became known as the great communicator, because voters either judged him to be a successful president, or, as I mentioned earlier, they were looking for ways to justify a victory which they themselves had not supported.
Thank you, Dan. I especially appreciate your kind comments because semi-accurate is about the best one can hope for when I speak. Before we go further, I think it's appropriate that Professor Rowland has a chance to respond to those who've responded to him. So, Robin.
This has been absolutely great. I have four quick comments. The first is I think all of this illustrates the importance of putting aside your ideology as much as you can and really looking at, in my case, the words. I think what we see on the left and right, the views of Reagan now are just caricatures. On the right, I've already quoted about that. And the same on the left. Do you remember the controversy in the 2008 campaign where Obama said that Reagan had changed the world in a way more fundamental than Bill Clinton, and it was an immense hoo-ha? What's the negative on what Obama said? We really need to look at who they really were. Secondly, I think a lot of what Reagan did was, and it comes out here, is a willingness to point out that the emperor had no clothes. Think of the controversy over the evil empire speech. Really? Who didn't believe the Soviet Union at that point was both evil and an empire? Reagan was just willing to say impolitic things to make a big point. Third point, and these much less involved in the speech writing process in the second term, that's also a time when problems occur to some. It seems to me the lack of the president's direct involvement may be just one more sign of that. And one fourth final point. Rhetoric president almost never gives a speech and public opinion changes. Ceremonial occasions, the Challenger speech, Obama speech in Tucson are examples. But on policy, it's almost never a direct change. But over time, rhetoric may resonate. This is something Craig's written about as well. Think about the effect that Ronald Reagan had on political ownership of the American dream as a narrative. For most of the 20th century, that's a Democratic story. By the end of Reagan's second term, that was fundamentally a conservative and Republican story. And the Democrats have struggled against that ever since. Over time, words really resonate. I think, by the way, if you look at the speech at Westminster, you'll see that. That's a speech that people made fun of when he gave it, and yet now it is chilling to read him speaking of his hope for the future that the Soviet Union would end up on the ash heap of history. In less than a decade, that was true.
Thank you for the comment that over time words really resonate, and that's where I'd like to begin and maybe pose the first question that you, Robin, or any other panelist can answer. Reagan is known for having a wonderful sense of humor. Indeed, one of my favorite devices that I use in my politics and media class when I'm talking about image is I play an extended CD of the president giving jokes to various audiences. And he could take, indeed, the same joke and give it to different audiences and give it slightly differently with a nuance to each audience. And what was most clear about the presentation was that Reagan enjoyed the jokes as much or more than the audience that was listening to them. He understood the power of the short quip, and he was profoundly capable of delivering them. Some of his lines will still create chuckles even though they're not complete jokes. They're what those of us in the study of rhetoric call enthematic in their construction. Think, hi, I'm from the federal government and I'm here to help. Or why send half your money to Washington when you can keep it and do for yourself what they're going to do for you? Or stories of government being intrusive of this kind. The question that I have is, did the words sometimes stick more than the underlying ideas? And have the words now been used to weaken our social contract, particularly the confidence that people may have in government institutions because Reagan was so capable with words? Or the attack on the woman with the welfare Cadillac as a statement that would create an impression in the public that there were those who were receiving assistance who weren't truly needy. And so as we judge the legacy of Reagan, do critics have a right to be concerned with the stickiness of some of those quips?
Well, I think that it's not only words, but props. And for me, the moment where that all came together so well and so effectively was in the 1988 State of the Union address. Reagan had been handed these huge continuing resolutions and was tired of all the amendments that were tacked to them. And he said, we had 4 continuing resolutions lasting 41 days, then 36 days, and 2 days, and 3 days. And then along came these behemoths. And everyone's attention suddenly was focused on these stacks of paper. And he would lift them up. This is a conference report, 1,053 pages weighing 14 pounds. Plop. Then this. 1,186 pages long, weighing 15 pounds, and he dropped it. At this point, the place was laughing and cheering, and the Congress was going crazy. The long-term continuing resolution, 1,057 pages, 14 pounds, and he went on doing this through these 4 stacks of paper, and then came the punchline. Congress should not send another one of these, and if you do, I will not sign it. Now, what he was attempting to do with the humor, the props, and the words was undercut this continuing resolution process. It didn't succeed ultimately. Newt Gingrich tried to end it also when he helped shut down the Clinton administration and then got blamed for shutting down the government. Was it erosive? In that case, I hope it would be, because I think the continuing resolutions are awful things. Was it corrosive in other venues? I think you have to debate what political philosophy you're advancing. It was corrosive to some liberal big government programs, certainly.
I think that rhetoric, the question of whether or not rhetoric creates public opinion is one that we argue and we argue and we argue. I think that if it does create public opinion or move it, that's a slow over time kind of process, and the preparedness debates are a lovely example of that. I think, though, that what rhetoric can do, and these quips are particularly good at, is perhaps amplifying and focusing public opinion that may already exist, but doesn't quite have form. And so Reagan told the story about the welfare queen in the Waldorf Astoria from like 1962 until he was in the White House. And he knew always that it was factually untrue. And because Democrats kept telling him, this is factually untrue. And Democrats would try to argue against Reagan with facts and statistics. And I think what they overlooked, and why it didn't so much work very well, is that what he was doing was telling emotional truths. People felt ripped off by the welfare system. And so if that particular story wasn't true, it didn't matter because it was still true. And so I think that those quips helped to focus things that people may have amorphously felt, although I have no idea how we would test that. And in that extent, I don't know if it's corrosive or if it's just taking something from under the table and putting it on the table, right? Which is both a bad thing and a good thing.
Tom, I think you asked 2 excellent questions, and I'll try to answer both very, very briefly. One is the use of humor, and whether it's Ronald Reagan or other successful communicators, start with the premise that humor is the riskiest form of political communication. If I were to make a poignant point, and I promise you I still have at least 3 or 4 opportunities for one before we get out of here today, so don't lose hope. I will have a relatively silent audience, to say, maybe a couple people nod. If I tell a joke that people like, there'll be an audible response. On the flip side, if I make a point that I think is poignant and no one thinks it is, it'll be the same response, maybe a few less heads nodding. If I tell a joke that nobody laughs at, as you saw during my presentation, that's a much more difficult communications failure, so it's risky. And the most successful humor I'd suggest to you, and Reagan I think was certainly not the only one who used this, but one of the best, is the best humor, particularly in politics, is self-deprecating humor. Because when you tell a joke about yourself, you are by the definition not mean-spirited. The story, and if Robert, I apologize if it was not in your paper because I've been reading so much about Ronald Reagan in preparation for this panel. It's beginning to merge together. You know, one of his most classic lines is when he was presented with a picture of himself and his co-star from the movie Bedtime for Bonzo. A lesser politician would have been embarrassed about something from his, not particularly dignified from his past. His response was, "Oh, I'm the one in the hat." And the best political communicators of both parties still understand that. The current president can stand up at the Al Smith dinner in 2008 and deliver what I think is the single funniest line I've ever heard from him, to say, "My name is Barack Hussein Obama, and I was named by someone who never thought I'd be running for president of the United States." And so the best communicators, Reagan or Obama, will make fun of themselves to achieve the greatest success in humor. And to get to I think your more important question, the humor you cited was not self-directed. It was directed at the size of government, and your question is appropriate to ask, did it have a corrosive effect? And I'd suggest to you that it did not have a corrosive effect as much as it changed the terms of the debate. All politicians have even presidents have a relatively limited window of opportunity through which to communicate a message. And a story, a quip, an example is going to engage voters' attention much more readily than a more detailed analysis. But I think Mary made an extremely important point when she says that story, that example, has to reinforce an existing or developing school of public belief. If I decide to start a campaign called "Don't Fund Our Schools," and I come up with examples for you of bad students, lazy students, fun stories, quips, lazy kids, it's probably not going to do that well, because that does not reinforce an existing belief about the importance of our schools. It flies in the face of it. And so I'd suggest to you that the outcome, with the exception of some Tea Partiers on one hand and MoveOn.orgers on the other, is a debate not about whether to eliminate government or to have it take over the private sector, but to how to have it work most efficiently, doing the things that it does best.
Humor is something I don't think can be taught. My favorite of Reagan's joke was his story that when he said that people say hard work never killed anyone, I say why take the chance? That, by the way, that really resonates with undergraduates. It seems to me that his ability with humor comes down in large part to his comfort in his own skin. And I think when a president is comfortable in his own skin or her own skin in the future and knows who they stand for, boy, that is an awfully powerful thing. Now, Tom's question about the corrosiveness, it seems to me that the things that President Reagan said that were critical of government, of course, they were legion. But the corrosiveness, if it has come, and I think, if you look at the credibility of government now, it really is an all-time low at all different levels. Comes in because we didn't hear everything he said. I quoted from the inaugural about how we needed to create a society that aided all Americans, that provided equality for all Americans. I quoted some of the reformative comments he made. In his farewell address, he talked about how we stopped a lot of things that needed to be stopping, implying very strongly that we didn't need to go further with that. In the 1992 convention address, where the Republicans are renominating George H.W. Bush, he speaks eloquently of making equality a reality in our central cities. We hear part of what Reagan said, and that part, I think, can be, and I think that's true of liberals just as much. That part, I think, is dangerous. On both sides, it's dangerous.
The part we hear, though, tends to be the quips, right? And the quips are the persistent story. So in answer, Dan, I just to dialogue a bit, when we hear today Grover Norquist, for instance, saying we should shrink government to the extent that it can be drowned in a bathtub, speakers such as that are claiming the legacy of the Reagan Revolution, to use that view of government, even if it's not necessarily the view that Reagan himself would have encouraged.
And as I said, Tom, and I think it's a good point, but going back to the what I was saying earlier, you certainly have people on both sides of the debate who will take more measured language and intensify it for their own purposes, no question about it. But in between those people who on one hand believe that government should play a dramatically more aggressive role in our daily lives, and those who, like Mr. Norquist, want to, I think he left out the verb strangle, but ultimately want it in our, able to fit in our bathtubs. There is, again, what I would suggest is not necessarily a consensus, but a conversation going on between the 40-yard lines about what government can do best and how effectively it can do it. And so I think, I don't think Reagan as much poisoned the debate, and certainly he and people who disagree with him gave license to more ideological outliers. But I think what it did is it simply moved the 40-yard lines a little bit about what government should be doing. And those in the respective end zones are going to make those cases whether the original point was made by quip or joke or example or extended treatise.
I think this is a good time to engage our audience. If anyone has questions, there will be a microphone that will find its way to you. Yes, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name. Hi, I'm Alex Shore. I'm a second-year master's in public administration student at the School of Policy Planning and Development. Actors are frequently given great rhetoric to deliver, and I'm hoping you guys could delve a little bit into the subject of actors turned politicians. What kind of role did Ronald Reagan's time as an actor, how did that shape him as a rhetorician in public life? And potentially, if willing and able, you could make some comparisons here to another governor turned actor and national political figure. I'm really interested in how acting and having access to rhetoric and delivering it so much in your profession can influence a politician in theirs.
Do you have any other particular actor turned governor in mind for us to compare?
Let me just say something quickly because I've recently completed a paper on this subject. Reagan memorized 50 scripts in Hollywood. Some of them were written by the best screenwriters in America. I mean, King's Row is a magnificent movie. Dark Victory is a magnificent movie. One of the things that made Reagan so popular, and one of the reasons he was elected to the Screen Actors Guild, was he not only learned his parts when he learned the script, he learned everybody else's. So when you were doing a scene with Reagan and you began to forget your lines, he could cue you, and it made him enormously popular. Now, how does that translate into the presidency? I think knowing those dialogues from those very good movies allowed him to edit his speechwriters because he had a better ear for what sounded right. So I think it was very important, and it translated very well into his presidential rhetoric.
Yeah, it seems to me, in a way, it was his ability as a writer and an editor that, he wasn't a great actor, but he was a pretty good actor. He was a great politician and a grade B actor. It seems to me, in a way, it's the other way around. It was his ability with language that made him pretty good as an actor, which also made him great as a politician.
I have sort of two things I would say about this, and one of them is that as a B-level actor, one of the things that characterized his acting was that he was what other actors call a giving actor, which your other governor, not so much. So, actors will talk about the great gift of being on stage or on screen with someone who is helping them do their job as opposed to someone who is sucking up all of the air in the room. And those are two very different kinds of leadership, but no matter which one you're enacting, having comfort with the medium of communication is an enormously important thing, right? Someone like Lyndon Johnson was very comfortable in big rooms. You know, he was a big guy. He could do magnificent speeches that allowed him to do a lot of, you put him on television and, oh my God, and it shows. And so what you see is not, wow, this is a guy who's really comfortable with a large audience but is nervous on television. What you see is, wow, this guy looks like a freak. And it doesn't help that, but Reagan was so comfortable in that smallness of television as opposed to necessarily the bigness of rooms, which he could also dominate, that he looked comfortable and helped make other people on the stage with him comfortable and helped make audiences comfortable. And that's the skill of a B actor in a lot of ways.
I think what each of the other panelists have alluded to very successfully, and so I won't bother to go into any more detail on it, is to summarize, though, a successful leader, political or otherwise, is very talented at establishing an emotional connection between himself or herself and the audience, whether it's an audience of one, an audience of thousands, or an audience of a television camera. And certainly theater and acting is one way of doing that. Our current president, I think, is very good proof that being a community organizer is another excellent way of developing those skills. There's lots of different ways to do it. Mary's point on the technology is an excellent one. William Jennings Bryan was an excellent communicator in very, very different ways than the best communicators of the 21st century are, because the times demanded a different skill set. And finally, as it relates to our I don't want to say our just departed governor, because that sounds a little more final than I think Ronald would prefer. Our newly liberated governor. I think from the standpoint of a staffer, a former staffer, the real value of a celebrity, whether it's a candidate or a supporter to a campaign, is it expands that window of opportunity that I was talking about earlier. Most people are only going to pay so much attention to a politician, but if that politician appears with an actor or a singer or an athlete, so much the better. And if that candidate brings with him or her his own cachet from the entertainment field, that expands the window even further than that. I would defer to the likes of Peter Hannaford or Stu Spencer to talk about the value of that expanded window that candidate Reagan brought to his first governor's race. But certainly it was probably one of the greatest contributors to Arnold Schwarzenegger's success as a candidate and as a public office holder, his ability to command just a much greater amount of attention than opponents with more conventional backgrounds. But as the other panelists have mentioned, the nature of the type of roles he played in movies was much different than Reagan's. Ronald Reagan was known as the Errol Flynn of the B movies. And smart people said that Errol Flynn was actually the Errol Flynn of the B movies. But Reagan did play roles that required that emotional connectedness, unlike Governor Schwarzenegger, whose films I greatly enjoy. But to paraphrase Mary, played roles that instead of requiring emotional connection, required emotional domination, which is an entirely different skill set.
He had a great relationship with Danny DeVito. I would just add two very quick things about this question. I think, first of all, Reagan understood being a celebrity as well as being an actor. And he especially understood after the Carter presidency that Americans wanted their president to live a somewhat different life than they did themselves. And so you may not remember the big controversy over the new China for the White House, or the fact that they were drinking a better quality of wines and that Hollywood stars were going, but I think that resonated very well with a lot of people who wanted to see their president have a little bit of ceremonial celebrity, and we don't have a royal family, so our president in that sense must serve. Reagan also, however, understood that he didn't want to only be the celebrity president. So the escapes to the ranch with the cowboy shirt and the chopping of brush and the riding of horse, which activated the Western myth and the Western narrative, I think played very well. And the most iconographic photograph I've ever seen of Reagan is the cowboy hat photo that I'm sure many of you have seen. Or if I were going to pick, the photo for this slide, I probably would have picked that one, because I think that was the Reagan of connection to people as well. And so I think that this understanding of the Hollywood culture was critical to his understanding of how to capture and create and shape his message. And I would still submit, by the way, that the best political ad for a candidate ever run was the 1984 It's Morning Again in America ad, which is just stunning. And you can find it on the website, The Living Room Candidate. But you look at the scene where they raise the flag and the beautiful children with the sun shining behind them, and the bride kissing her granddaughter, and the couple buying or remodeling a house. I mean, it's a stunning ad that doesn't say much of anything specific other than be optimistic, things are improving, and they're only going to get better if you give this administration another term. And I think, Reagan understood that kind of drama, and clearly it was his life on the screen that helped him understand that. Another question?
I'm Howard Remond. I'm a professor here at SPPD. Now, there's been a story circulating that George Will, who was working in the Carter White House in 1980, made the briefing books for Carter's talks at the 1980 debate available to candidate Reagan. Is there any truth to this story? And if so, what impact, if any, did it have on the subsequent debate and election?
I've heard the story, but I don't know if there's proof or not.
I don't think it's ever been verified. I think Reagan, in the debate against Carter, that was preceded by the debate against John Anderson. And that debate, if you do what Robin did, and I did with that debate, what Robin did with the Carter-Reagan debate, John Anderson wins that debate in terms of argumentation, extension, statistics, and so on and so forth. But he reveals himself to be a liberal instead of a conservative, and there's a shift within the voters over to Reagan, which gets him then in the polls to be close to Carter. Carter, who has watched that debate, says, let's debate him, I can beat him. And then Reagan beats Carter, having learned from the Anderson debate, or it's just Reagan being Reagan. The sad moment, as you all recall, for Reagan in debates was in 1984 in the first debate with Mondale. And what happened there, to the best of my understanding as I can reconstruct it, is he was handed a huge briefing book, and he treated it like a script and tried to memorize the whole damn thing. And so it just didn't come out naturally from his mouth. And the First Lady insisted, and other people insisted, that in the second debate with Mondale, we're just going to let Reagan be Reagan, and he was great. And so, some of these stories can be verified and others can't, but there was that rumor about the 1980 debate with Carter, and I don't think it's true. I think it's just Reagan learned how to handle that situation. There was also the question of expectation, and the press said Carter's going to be great, he was a nuclear engineer, he's so bright, and Reagan, and so, Reagan so exceeded expectations that the debate was devastating and led to a Republican landslide.
I don't think the importance of briefing books is very great. I mean, at that point, it was certainly not a surprise what Reagan's positions were on the issues and what Carter's positions were on the issues. And so that, I've done a lot of debate preparation at the congressional level in Kansas, and you know what the other side's going to say. But the other point is that if you remember that debate, some of President Carter's comments, especially in the rebuttals, were, let us say, idiosyncratic. There is no, to say they were on point would not be accurate. There's no way that Reagan could have been prepared for those responses because no one would have predicted those responses. And he kept saying in the debate, but this is the argument I just made and you've not responded to that. That had to be Reagan. There's just no way that could have been prepped in advance.
Yeah, I agree with Robin because particularly given the fact that Carter was a sitting president, the function of the media, if nothing else, is to put the president on the record on his issue positions. Carter was on the record, and what his people probably did was go through his past speeches and past statements and slap them into a briefing book so that he could remember them. Certainly Reagan's staff was every bit as capable of doing that.
My name is Jack Cox. I was Chief of Staff to Barry Goldwater Jr. in the U.S. Congress in President Reagan's campaign. But there was another actor that no one ever talks about that predated Reagan. What I'm interested in is because you all talk about this. And I know personally from him that when George Murphy won the Senate seat in 1964, and I've heard very few discussions at all about bringing George Murphy into this because they were both very close friends. So I'm interested in your research, Robin, and others. What impact did you think George Murphy leading Reagan into this? Because remember, George Murphy won when Barry Goldwater got killed. So, and I knew that had an impact on his decision to run for governor in 1965. So, have any research ever been done on that about the relationship between Reagan and Murphy?
I'd speculate on it this way. One thing we do know is that Reagan was very close to Robert Montgomery. Robert Montgomery became an advisor to the Eisenhower campaign. He was the media consultant for them, and he brought Reagan in. He convinced Reagan that Eisenhower would make a better president. That was part of the conversion process that we talked about in some papers last night. And Robert Montgomery's role in that has always been underplayed. You're absolutely right that George Murphy was very close to Reagan. They've been in movies together. And Murphy had a tremendous sense of humor. In that year, he debated Pierre Salinger, who had been appointed to the seat. And I remember the debate. I was 3. One of the things that George Murphy did, that was so funny, they go through this whole debate, and Murphy kept interrupting Salinger, and he kept going on too long, and the moderators were getting nervous and upset. And finally they said, okay, now it's time for your closing statements. And George Murphy says, I give all my time to Pierre, I've taken too much time from him, and backed off the microphone. And Pierre Salinger was completely flummoxed by that maneuver. I can only induce from that Ronald Reagan, who was involved in that, the campaign with Goldwater at the time, must have seen that and learned something from it.
I also did not have direct experience with the Murphy campaign, but I'll offer you just a broader observation. The hardest thing to do in politics is to get a voter to do something for the first time. It's 1,000 times easier to get them to do it again. So a Democrat who votes for Ronald Reagan is immeasurably more likely to vote for George Bush Sr. 8 years later. A Republican who votes for Bill Clinton is much more likely to realize that a Dianne Feinstein or Ray Davis or Al Gore is also appealing to them. And I would guess, and again I would defer to Peter and to others who have much more direct experience than me, that the experience of watching Murphy run for office show his familiarity with the political landscape couldn't have helped but to help Reagan, if for no other reason than just conditioning the electorate to certainly not identical, but similar biography.
I want to respond kind of obliquely. There's a famous story about when Reagan was going to run for governor that Jack Warner said, no, Jimmy Stewart for governor, Ronald Reagan for best friend. And I've always thought that if you were casting a movie, that's exactly right. But the difference was that Jimmy Stewart was a great actor, but Ronald Reagan had something to say. And it seems to me it's that something to say part that is most important. And that the people who, I don't think it really matters so much whether it's probably helpful, but it's that having something to say.
And all I know about Senator George Murphy is his ringing defense of short-handled hose for migrant farm workers. Sorry.
I'm Vincent Lee. I'll ask a simple question and you can answer me a few words in a simple sentence.
This panel may not be able to do that.
Anyway, in Korea we have an old saying, a true great leader is known truly known after he dies, after all the people who knew him died. So in that sense, can you tell me what is the greatest accomplishment he has made for American people, so that they will remember him, respect him 50 years or 100 years?
They tore down the wall. I think that.
I said American people.
Yeah, that he virtually won the Cold War
Without a shot being fired.
I would just add on top of that there are certainly substantive accomplishments Cold War economic achievements of the 1980s, but in the United States that I think had become laced with self-doubt in the aftermath of Watergate and Vietnam. It's a little bit too facile to say he made people proud to be Americans again, but if you look at the nature of the political debate among successful leaders in both parties, Bush's, Clinton's, that attitude is something that has become much more pervasive in the national dialogue as a result of the pivot point that Reagan engendered through the substantive achievements that Robert and Greg are talking to.
And sir, I think we don't know yet. Maybe because some of the people who worked with him are still living, but more likely because his legacy is still very much open for debate. And we'll know in a generation or two how the claims about the Reagan legacy moved, informed, and shaped American society. And I think that's still very much an open book.
You know, let me add one more thing. I hear what Tom's saying about the anti-government conservatives who draw from Reagan. I think not listening to all of him. But in an odd way, Reagan shifted the debate for liberalism. At the time, the liberal view of solving problems was a regulatory one. And now, the idea that liberals always believe if you can use the market first, that is a better way to reform problems. Think even of the things that people object to most in a health care bill. It's an individual mandate. It's a market-based reform. The same thing proposed on cap and trade. Reagan shifted the debate and changed liberalism as well as conservatism.
Thank you very much for your gracious participation. Robin was kind enough to bring a few copies of his paper for those of you who just can't wait. I look forward to chatting with you during the break. Thank you, Pam.
I want to thank you, Tom, and Robert, Craig, Mary, Dan, for a really challenging, I would say challenging in the sense of making us think differently and bringing information to us that is, at least in my experience, I literally lived through it, but I surely didn't remember it all. And so this is very helpful and for all of us, so please join me in thanking the panel.